Hey everyone, and welcome back to my tutorials. In this video, I'm going to go over how I color in my different pieces. To start off, I just want to say that there's so many different ways to color. This is just how I tend to tackle it on my paintings. The first thing I want to discuss is how to color in digital paintings. I feel a lot of these tutorials are separated, but hand in hand they go the same. We've all been there, you spend ages coloring because the paint bucket tool still doesn't know when to fill in those white spots, or you just spend a ton of time trying to figure out how to color properly. And so I'm going to start with that first, because it took me a really long time myself to figure this out. Now, there are a few settings in Clip Studio Paint that can help speed up the process of coloring. Once we go over these steps, I will go over how I personally choose colors and how that works into my final illustrations. Alright, let's go. There are so many ways to color your flat colors. The ones I normally use are the paint bucket, the magic wand tool, and the lasso tool. Both the bucket and magic wand tool typically need you to use line art for it to fill up the image, and they are typically what I use. However, I will say now that I use all of these methods regularly regardless. It just depends on what I'm painting at the time. Now, I'm going to save a ton of time for everyone that uses Clip Studio Paint. I will typically use the paint bucket with something called a reference layer turned on my line art layer in Clip Studio Paint. You can do this by going to your layers, make sure that you're on your line art layer, and hit this weight icon here to turn on layer referencing. Now once that's on, you go back to your paint bucket and go onto a new layer. In the settings of the paint bucket tool, you will see the same icon. Make sure that this is turned on with the paint bucket tool, and now when you click with the paint bucket on your drawing, you'll see that it fills in the areas where the line art is because it's referencing only that layer and nothing else. You might notice as well, Carly, there's still really annoying bits of white where it didn't fill in the colour. No worries, just go back to your paint bucket tool and go into the settings again. The setting area scaling helps with the white bits that stick out on the drawing. By turning this setting up, you're telling the program to colour about 2 or 3 or 4 pixels out more than what it normally would have with this setting put to default. It's really nice. There is another setting you will notice in the paint bucket area called tolerance, and while they might sometimes look like they do similar things, they do have their differences. This setting tells the program that it doesn't need to be as picky about where to put the colour. Here's a quick example. There are 2 colours that you want to change to one singular colour. However, you don't want to go back to change every single instance of these 2 colours needing changed. By turning up this setting, you're telling the program that it doesn't need to be quite as picky about changing these specific colours on the layer. And ta-da! You have both of these colours changed to the one colour. With the paint bucket tool as well, if you notice there are still white bits after using these tools, you can use this fill gaps bucket tool or go over it with the lasso tool. Either way is perfectly fine. Now, the magic wand tool is probably the easiest to use out of all of these 3. However, like I said earlier, it does depend on having really strong line art or shapes in your piece. It works by going around the outside of your line art or object and giving a good selection that way. If there are still gaps, you can always add on to it by using Shift to add on or using the lasso tool to fill in the rest of the selection. And finally, the lasso tool is the best to talk about. It's the most versatile and easy to use. All you have to do to use this is grab the tool and select what you like. If you need to add on to the selection, you can do this by using Shift, and if you want to take away from the selection, you can use Alt on the keyboard. Now that I've talked about the tools on how to color easier, let's talk about how I actually go about coloring on my pieces. So this might be a little controversial, but I am a lover of the grayscale method. So with that said, you don't have to use grayscale to learn how to color. It's just the way that I like to color my pieces. That may change in the future, but at the moment that is my current style. I like to start off the image in grayscale. If you know or have been following me for a while, you might know that I am a huge fan of the grayscale shading method. It was my first tutorial and honestly has helped my art so much since I've implemented it into my work. However, if you're doing a simpler cell shading method, you can just do the shading right after you've done the colours. So first, I know I made a big deal about the grayscale, but it'll come in handy later. I will turn off my grayscale layer and only allow myself to think in flat colours and why they look best together as flats. Afterwards, if I think the colours need a little bit adjusting, I will change them slightly. However, I do find that if I just focus on the colours that look nice together without worrying about the shading, the line art or anything else going on in the piece, I will typically get a better result than going in all at once. So I turn off my grayscale layer and start to pick a couple of colours that I think look nice and make sense for the character. At this point, I am only thinking about the colours that look nice together and contrast between my colours. Contrast is really important to show what you should be looking at in the picture. There are two types of contrast when talking about colours. These are saturation and the darkness of your colours. Saturation is a great way to quickly bring the eye to where you want it to look at the piece. The darker you get with the colours, the more contrast you get. A lot of people, when they start colouring, use this method where you pick one colour and try to stay in this pastel range of colours by only moving the colour wheel around. This can actually lack an interesting contrast, so it's important to pick your colour flats from this whole area in the colour wheel. Just be careful about going too dark if you're using grayscale layer on the process. People also tend to oversaturate their colours for the whole entire piece, making it really hard for your eye to focus on where to look at. So by using saturation and darkness in your piece is very important to not overwhelm the viewer and to bring the eye to what you want them to look at. Now, going back to turning on the grayscale layer later in the process, you can always change your colours if you find once you put your grayscale layer back and it's just a little bit too dark or it just doesn't look as nice, you can tweak your colours a tiny bit. And that's what I often do in my pieces as well, is if it's too dark, I'll change it to a lighter colour in the piece. The last point in my art that really made me go huzzah when I first heard it was the point about colour being a lot about cold and warm colours when discussing colour theory. And this always really confused me when I heard it at first. I thought that all the shadows always had to be a cold colour and all the warm colours had to be a yellow or an orange, but that's not the case. And the thing that blew my mind when I sat and thought about it is that colour is relative to what is around it. Therefore, you can have a cold red colour and a warm blue colour depending on how you use it in a piece. And you can see brilliant artists using this all the time in their work. And so it's something I'm personally trying to get better at, but just keep that in mind in the future, that you can have a cold red and you can have a warm blue when you're drawing. Okay, so now we have our flats and it has nice colours going on. I want to put my grayscaler underneath my colours and change all my colour layers to multiply. From here, you might be thinking this looks a little dead, a little dull, but this is where I adjust my grayscale layer from straight black to a very saturated but still dark shadow colour. Like this colour. Now that looks better. Now this is looking very good and sometimes I do just stop here. However, sometimes I go over a piece with something called a paint over to make it pop a little bit more. For example, the face here, I'll put in a few more interesting shadow colours or some highlights in the face by taking that local colour and saturating it a tiny bit and changing the hue slightly. I might add something called subsurface scattering through the skin, and this is just where light shines through the skin and can make the painting look more interesting. This will typically happen if you see light shining directly through your nose or your earlobes, but it happens all throughout the skin in various parts of the body. It can make the painting look more interesting, and it's typically just adding a very saturated pink or orange colour to where the light hits the skin. You'll even see some YouTubers, and I've seen some artists as well, where they just take their shadow layer, they duplicate it, and then they add in a blurred really red underlayer to the skin, and it gives this really nice effect. Now that's about it for how I colour in a couple of easy steps. Like I said, there are tons of different ways to colour, so it's important to experiment to find what you like. This video is more of a jumping off point. If you would like a video going over colour theory, there are some amazing videos here on YouTube that can give a deep dive into it. I personally found that Understanding Colour by Blender Guru was immensely helpful. Anyways, thanks for sticking around until the end of the video. If you'd like to support me, I do have a book up on my Etsy shop about creatures you can find in Dungeons & Dragons, and if that isn't up your alley, you can support me on Patreon, where you can get exclusive access to my personal work and the breakdown behind it. Of course, I also have my line art brush out for free on my Gumroad, so feel free to pick that up as well if you haven't. Thanks to everyone who has supported me as well in subscribing, commenting, liking, or sharing my video. It goes a long way to support me, and it really does mean the world to me. Anyways, I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!